Hey everyone, welcome to episode 327 of F-Stop, Collaborate and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. On today's episode, I had a fantastic conversation with French astrophotographer and aurora specialist, Adrien Mauduit. Adrien and I talk all about his obsession with the aurora, and he provides countless actionable tips and rock-solid information that will improve your chances of capturing the aurora, and it will enhance your knowledge about how the aurora is formed. Adrien is also offering listeners a discount on his aurora chasing course using the code FSTOPCollab2023. I'll be sure to put a link to that in our show notes. All right, well, let's get started with this week's episode with Adrien Mauduit. All right, Adrien Mauduit, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
Yeah, of course. It's always good to talk to another bald white guy.
There you go.
Yeah, and I think I became aware of you because a lot of people recommended you for the podcast over the years. But also, I got to see some fascinating stuff going on Twitter that was centered around you recently, which reminded me, I should probably reach out to this guy because he seems really cool.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, there's been this debacle on Twitter, and I think that that echoed throughout the community as as a content creator. A lot of content creators reached out to me that I never talked to in the past, and they've supported me. So I think this is a subject that we can talk about at length because it's just I don't know. I don't have any adjectives for now, but I'll have by the end of the podcast for sure.
All right, sounds good. Well, Adrien, for people that aren't familiar with you and your work, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right, so I'm a 34-year-old photographer, French photographer, and I started my career not as a photographer actually about 10 years ago. I started as a master's degree or master's in science, in environmental sciences, especially. But then after, long story short, after the economical crisis back then, when I was finished with my studies, I couldn't find a job in my branch, which is ecology. And so I found a teaching position in Denmark. So finished my studies in France and Canada. I switched a bit too fast now. But then back to Denmark, I found this teaching position. I think it was high school, about that level. And so that allowed me to have a lot of time for myself to do other stuff. And among these other things, I got involved with photography via the aurora, and I think we'll talk more about it in just a moment. And so that's how I got into astrophotography, and now I'm a full-time photographer based out of Tromsø in northern Norway. So that's within the Arctic Circle, and if you can see, if I turn my screen gently, it is snowing. So that is a bit crazy. We're about to kick off June, and it's snowing, and it's about 8 p.m. and you see it's fully bright outside. So we're in the midnight sun season where the sun never sets. And of course we can talk more about it as well. It's a very difficult lifestyle that we have here in the north. But so now I'm a full-time photographer. I don't do a lot of workshops like a lot of photographers. I do more content creating for production companies, so I do mostly time-lapse and real-time films. I still do take stills for clients, but that represents maybe less than 5% of my revenue. So I have Aurora workshops and Aurora courses, and I think we're gonna come back on those as well. And I do a lot of content for social media and everything. So I have a lot of passive income in that regard, and in between I have jobs filming and so I touch a bit on everything, and it's hard for me to define specifically what I do when people ask me, I don't have like this specific job, and I do a lot of different things, but all in all, I make it work. And so I'm here with my partner. We just bought a house in beautiful Norway, and so this is my situation right now. I'm not sure what more I can add for people to understand where what I do and where I live. But
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So obviously we're going to talk a lot about aurora and night photography, but I'm super curious now, having heard that. Do you ever do just, normal landscape photography that doesn't include the night sky and the aurora? Like, are you ever out shooting sunrise or sunset or intimate scenes or things like that?
funny enough, I do it every now and then, I guess, but
Hmm.
I don't specialize on that. So I tried that at the very beginning when I started touching, or like getting my hands on the camera. But I quickly realized that for some reason, I'm still attracted to a beautiful landscape. There's something undeniable about that. I don't know. There's something more appealing to darkness and the night sky. So sunsets and sunrises, beautiful. If there's an animal in there, perfect. But I'm really attracted to anything astro. So whether it's Milky Way, galaxies, noctilucent clouds, I think we'll talk more about those as well. Any night sky phenomena, yeah, those are my specialization for sure.
Well, you certainly live in the right place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, you have like 6 months of the year where you basically don't have sun?
Yes, only 2 months.
Oh,
So
okay. But, it's like you have a lot more darkness.
yeah, I think that's one of the misconceptions. Well, I'm not gonna say misconceptions, but when we say we live in the Arctic, it's like, oh my gosh, like you must be like in darkness the whole time, and it's actually we have 2 months of the sun not rising at all and not setting at all, but the course of objects in the sky is really gentle here in the Arctic. So
Right.
for example, for these 2 months in the winter, at the dead of the winter, we still have the sun doesn't cross the horizon, but it still lingers in that twilight zone for those hours. So we still have like a little bit of twilight, which of course is not pure sunlight, right? It's not like the sun is hitting your face, but still a little bit of light. But if you go way further north in Svalbard, for example, they do have darkness the whole day. And in the summer, yeah, we do have the sun never sets. So
Yeah, yeah, it's quite a different lifestyle for sure. I'm not sure I personally could get used to that, but what I do appreciate it about it from a landscape photography perspective is, in those shoulder seasons, you've got those sunrises and sunsets that last like 2, 3 hour long, it's fantastic.
yeah, so in the summer, I think for a landscape photographer, coming to the fjords, to the Norwegian fjords, and getting around midnight. So no, that kind of compels you to stay, up around midnight. But I think that's not no problem for most landscape photographers. But you get that golden hour for like ages, for like
Right.
3 4 hours, and it hits the fjords in this different from a different angle. So you really get the mountains lit up from the north and getting that golden color. I mean, it's just oh wow! And as you said, in the shoulder seasons, in the fall and in the spring, we get those long. We get everything. We get sunrises, sunsets, aurora, the fall colors. We do get a lot of things here, so
Yeah,
that's why that attracts a lot of people.
for sure. So let's talk about Aurora. So how did you fall in love with photographing the Aurora?
So aurora is what got me into photography. So the for the little story, I was in teaching in that boarding school in Denmark, and one of my colleagues was the cadet teacher at the school. So he was used to being outside, at night with the students for extended period of time. So he was used to being in the hills, looking at the horizon, looking at the stars and everything. And one day around the teacher's room, we were talking about our bucket lists, and I told him that my biggest dream was to see the aurora. And so he told me, did you know we could see the aurora from Denmark? And so I looked at him. I remember looking at him with a face like, there's no way you could see the aurora from Denmark. Because in my head, aurora could be seen only in far north places, or like close to the polar places like Alaska, Iceland, Norway. But Denmark, I was like, no, there's no way. So one night that he told me there are good chances to see aurora. He told me to head out to that beach. So I did, and then so I waited there for like hours and hours and hours on end in the cold Danish wind on the Baltic. And so after 5 hours on the beach, nothing happened, and I was like, yeah, so I'm convinced now that he was definitely kidding me. But so on the way back, I was walking back to the car, and the tree line in front of me, it lit up completely, and I had no idea. For a split second, I just had no idea what it was. And so, in my head, really for a split second, I thought, oh, maybe that's the moon rising, or like a boat lighting up, because behind me was the sea, basically. So I had no idea what it was. So I turned back, and I think that's the spark, right? You see something that is so unfamiliar, and so I love nature, generally speaking, but that is something that I had never seen with that intensity and the way it moved. So what I was seeing behind me was the whole sea was sort of covered and reflecting these beautiful pillars, although they weren't that saturated with the naked eye. But honestly, that didn't really, I think that's it's a problem that a lot of people have. It's like, oh, but that's not saturated. But to me, I was so caught up in the moment, looking at these beautiful pillars dance on the horizon, that did something in me, I think. And so I was like, wow, mind blown. So I went back home, still heart pumping out of my chest because of the adrenaline and everything. I actually purchased the camera right there on the spot. It was probably like 3, 4 in the morning. I was like, doesn't matter. Went to my laptop, and then got a camera from Amazon. Got my first camera ever, and then when it arrived, I went back to the beach and tried to capture the aurora again. And so, of course, my first results were really, really bad. But I'm kind of proud to show these terrible pictures, because it just shows the progression of where I started from and then where I'm at now. And then after that, I started really getting my hands on the whole thing. I started looking at or watching tutorials on YouTube on how to do, practicing a lot outside. Whenever I had time, I just went outside. And now this is my full-time profession, so
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, what year was that when you had that epiphany?
So that was 2014, so that's almost 10 years, 9 years.
Yeah, nice. Okay. Well, man, that's amazing. I did a trip to Iceland in 2018, and I'd never seen the aurora before that. Not really. I think I saw it very faintly once in Oregon when I lived there, but it was very faint. Nothing like the dancing lights and all that, which, I fortunately, when I was in Iceland, we had 5 straight days of aurora, and I think one of those was like a KP7, and I was actually at Vesterhorn at low tide, and, all the water had just like dumped into the pools there, and so you had the aurora reflecting in the water, and I was just like, what am I looking at? It was almost hard to operate the camera because you were just so blown away by what you were seeing.
Yeah. It's the first that the first time I saw the aurora was, of course, to me it was already like mind blowing. But when I really saw the aurora for the first time, it was also in Iceland, believe it or not. And I think there's an undescribable feeling when you see it, when it kind of covers the whole sky. It's just, where's that coming from? And that's what you described, right? It's like, where's that? How is that moving so fast? It's incredible.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, we're going to dive deeply into this topic today for sure. I would love for you to talk about your aurora chasing workflow that you've created, because I know from my experience spending, I guess it was 8 days in Iceland I was there. We spent a lot of time chasing the aurora, looking at weather forecasts, trying to understand, okay, where are the clouds? Where's the storm? There's a lot of variables. So I'm curious kind of what your workflow is and kind of what your approach has been.
All right, so there's something I think a lot of people need to know and I think we're going to come back afterwards, so I'm not going to expand too much on that before I start with the workflow, is that If you come to a zone called the auroral zone, that's where the aurora is on average 100% of the time. So that's where you have the best chances to see the aurora. So Iceland is in the middle of this zone. And so it's a good place to see the aurora. So your main issue at that point is not going to be the aurora, because on any given night, you will see at least a little bit of something. So your main issue, especially in Iceland, is the weather. And the weather in Iceland has this particularity is it has another layer of weather that other places don't have, and that's volcanism. Actually, volcanoes generate a lot of water vapor, so it creates this layer of lower clouds that is very hard to predict, and that goes with the pressure and with the wind. So Iceland has this extra difficulty in that way. So it is still a beautiful place to capture the aurora from, don't get me wrong, but it's probably a bit more difficult to dodge the clouds in Iceland. And my experience tells me that you need to be ready to drive sometimes 5-6 hours around the
Yes.
that ring road around Iceland to be able to see something.
Yeah, that was definitely my experience.
Yeah, mine too. But to go back on the workflow, so the very first step, there are 3 steps. So the very first step is and I think that's for people who want to dive a little bit more into the subject. So if you just want to deal with the aurora and you just want to know about the aurora, maybe this first step is probably not for you. So the first step is to get acquainted and monitor what we call space weather. So that is basically the weather that is in space, and that is at the base of the aurora here on Earth, because the aurora is created very far away from us, originates from the sun. So the first step is to really keep up with the sun, basically, and what the sun is producing. And you can do so by following a few people, especially on social media. There is Dr. Tamtheskov. She's one of the pioneers in the community, and she produces these weekly forecasts. So not only space weather forecasts, but also aurora possibilities. And I think just keeping up with that is enough, to be honest. And there are a few other people that you can follow on Twitter. There's Halo CME, that other scientists. Generally speaking, is scientists and forecasters. I wouldn't, follow anyone else because this field is very new and there are lots of misconceptions and errors to be made. So that is the first step. The second step is when you're already there, not necessarily in the field, but when you started your journey to chase the lights, keep up with what we call the solar wind data. And those are data that are measured on the way from the sun to the earth. So whatever the sun is spewing out into space, we have placed satellites strategically outside of our magnetic shield on the way from the sun to the earth, and we can kind of probe what is in what we call the solar wind. And so those things are very important because they're coming towards us, more or less. And so we kind of know in advance, usually between 30 minutes to an hour, what is coming towards us. So that is, for example, the wind speed, the direction of the magnetic field. So those things can be a bit complicated for the layman, but when you start, scratching the surface, those are actually not that complicated. So you want to pay attention to those things. And so the last step is, when you're in the field this time, is to keep up with the auroral activity, because that the aurora is never constant. That's never, that's one of the misconceptions, that the aurora is dancing in the night sky all the time. And I think you experienced that in Iceland as well. So it's not the case. So you want to be able to pay attention to what's happening in the sky. And to do that, you can use webcams, of course. You can use people's reports on social media. There are some apps as well that, where people can report. And there are other things called magnetometers, where you can kind of see the graphs and see where you have deflections, and usually they tell you what is above that observatory. But this is a bit more complicated. Just to go back on the second step about the solar wind, I didn't tell you where to get that solar wind data. So you get that solar wind data on, the best source is, the raw source is the NOAA website, what's called the Space Weather Prediction Center. And you get the data by just looking at two satellites, ACE and Discover satellites, and that's in the data section of that website. But all the different apps and websites, I mean, if you use a different app for aurora chasing, they will have these data coming from NOAA. So, but I think this is the best source because they have different things you can do. While on apps, there are things that you can't do. So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
And then, is it pretty much the same approach at both poles?
Yes. There is a little bit of, I guess I'm not going to say discrepancies, but most of the aurora on the North Pole and the South Pole, they're kind of mirrored. But in recent years, they've actually realized that they're not as equal as they thought. And actually, the aurora in the southern hemisphere, too bad for us, is actually stronger than the aurora, on average, than the aurora in the northern hemisphere. But we still get beautiful shows here, so it kind of doesn't matter.
Right. And then maybe touch a little bit on, KP, and, you always hear like, oh, it's a KP 7, like you better get ready. Like, what does that mean?
Right, so actually I was going to get into the misconception. I kept it for misconceptions, but we can take it now because that's always a point. That's probably the biggest misconception in the aurora world. And I really regret that this number is advertised not only by whether it's photographers, people in the community, but also unfortunately by the big entities, because the KP index, believe it or not, was not created for aurora chasing, but by extension and by proxy, it is still correlated in some ways, and I will explain to you. But by proxy, entities like NOAA and the Space Weather Prediction Center and all the scientists, they use the KP as a reference for aurora, but it really isn't telling you anything about the aurora with enough relevance as an aurora chaser. So what is the KP index? The KP index is basically a measure at any given time of what we call the geomagnetic activity. The geomagnetic activity is basically what the magnetic field of the Earth is doing at any given moment. And that is transcribed into a number of strength, if you will. It goes from 0 to 9, 0 being the lowest, so like a quiet magnetic field of the Earth, and 9 being extreme. And so that's when the magnetic field of the Earth is completely rattled by, for example, a solar storm. That's when we get such KP numbers. So where does the KP come into play when it comes to aurora? Well, of course, the more the KP, the higher the KP is, generally speaking, the more widespread the aurora is. That means usually it's confined at the poles, and when we have when the field of the Earth is really rattled, it kind of opens more at the poles, and so the auroral ring around the poles, what we call the oval, it expands towards lower latitude, and that's when you see aurora at lower latitudes.
Gotcha.
But so these two are correlated, but they're not precise. The KP alone is not precise enough to tell you, for example, the latitude at which the aurora will end up being. And I think that's probably the biggest mistake that people make, is that they look at these maps that the entities have produced. We call those the KP or KP lines of visibility. And it tells you, for example, KP1, it will be visible in Alaska. KP5, it will be visible in Minnesota, et cetera, et cetera. But those, believe it or not, are really, I'm not going to say they're wrong, but they're not precise enough at all. And I really stress the at all. For example, very recently there was a KP4, and according to those maps, the aurora should have been seen only, in central Canada. They could never have been seen all the way south to, I don't know. I have to translate because it was in Europe, but they
Well,
were seen way further south.
I know here we could see it in like Arizona, which is
Yeah,
unheard of.
exactly. So that night during that KP4 equivalent US, that would have been seen in I would say the central states,
Yeah.
right? And so according to these maps, if you only rely on these maps, most people see KP4, they would never have gone out, never ever, and they would have missed the aurora because it was seen way further south. So the KP index just does something and the aurora does something else, and it depends on other factors that the KP index doesn't take into account. So my advice to you as an aurora chaser is keep the KP index. I know it's tempting because it's a nice number, you don't have to look at anything else, but please keep the KP index outside of your toolbox when you go chasing the aurora.
So if you're perhaps someone that lives in Oregon or even Colorado, what's a better way to predict whether or not you'd be able to see it on any given night?
All right, so for lower latitudes, or what we call mid latitudes, you can never predict the aurora.
Okay, good. There we go.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's something that we cannot do. And I know that there are things when on the NOAA website and even the NASA that says aurora forecast, but that is something that we just cannot do, and we can do it but with not enough relevance for us.
Right,
For
it's
example, if
rolling the dice.
yeah, for example, if the forecast is right 10% of the time, that's definitely not a good tool to use, right? So someone in Oregon, for example, who wants to see the aurora, I would say keep up with just use the workflow. Keep up with what's coming towards us. If there's a big CME, then that doesn't mean automatically you will see aurora. That means the chances are increased because solar storms, or CMEs as we call them, they can miss us very easily, miss the Earth.
Corona mass ejection, is that?
That's it.
Yeah.
And so, so keep up with the space weather, then keep up closer or more closely with the solar wind to see if that CME is actually hitting us. And you'll see by then a lot of people, including me on social media, will be posting, oh, it looks like the CME has reached us right now. So good chances at high and low latitudes. And then when we have a solar storm hitting us, it's here to stay for several days. So generally 2 days, sometimes 3 or 4. So at that point, just go outside and try your luck. And yeah.
Love it. All right. Well, with that being said, what are some of the biggest mistakes that people make when chasing the aurora?
All right. So definitely KP is probably the biggest mistake that people can make. But I think we covered that already. All right, another mistake I think is that a lot of people think the aurora stays the same, or at least they're going to look at the same aurora if they travel to Iceland, for example. They think they're going to look at the same aurora throughout the whole night, right? And that's essentially wrong. The aurora along that ring, right, along that oval, is actually not the same or produced by the same processes whether you're at 7 p.m., 12 p.m. Or a.m. or in the morning sector. And so you're going to see these kind of different auroras along this oval, and this oval will also expand and retract whether following the geomagnetic activity, right? So you have a lot of different factors whether this oval will kind of cross your location and you will be able to see the aurora, and what type of aurora you will see. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. And most aurora around the midnight, but be careful, it's not the local midnight, which is solar midnight, or the time that's on your watch. That is the magnetic midnight. It's slightly different. It's when you as an observer, geomagnetic North Pole and the sun are in line. So that doesn't necessarily correspond to solar midnight, which is the North Geographic Pole. And so around that midnight, for Iceland and Norway, that's around normal midnight, so that's nice. But for Alaska, it's more 2:30 p.m. A.m. Right, so it's closer to morning time. But around that time, plus or minus 4 hours, you will have what we call the substorms. So those are mini storms which always work in a charging, growing process and then release process. So for a long time, the aurora will be quiet, and then all of a sudden it will explode into, you know, the beautiful, bright, dancing pinks and greens and reds that we know. And afterwards, there is a recuperating phase, what we call the recovery phase. So it always works in this kind of cycles. You can have 1, 2, 3 substorms during one night. Sometimes you have more. So the goal, if you want to be an avid aurora chaser, is to know what type of aurora that you're in. For example, if you're too early at night, you will not get the substorms. You will just get, you know, the stable aurora in the sky. But if you're in the midnight sector, you will need to know what phase of the substorm you're in to see if the substorm has already exploded, so I can wait maybe 2-3 hours for another substorm to form. So that's another thing. And then maybe a last misconception is that the aurora doesn't depend on tropospheric weather, because the aurora happens so high up in almost at the edge of space, right, in the atmosphere. The separation between our normal weather, all the clouds, which doesn't go above 7 miles, right? The aurora is 55 miles up, starting, right, and way above. So there's no relationship between cold, wind, rain, clouds that we get on Earth and the aurora. Those are two independent things. So yeah, those are the misconceptions, I think, that
Okay.
people... Yeah.
And you had touched on it earlier, but you started talking about all the different colors, reds and purples and greens and whites. And I'm curious, at risk of putting our listeners to sleep, like, can you maybe explain what creates those different colors? And if possible, is there any way for us to when the colors will appear?
All right. So I'm also going to try not to put people to sleep. To make things simple and to give the bigger picture. So how the aurora is created is particles from the sun that are charged particles. It's mostly electrons. They are we call it precipitated. That means they're accelerated into our atmosphere. But the atmosphere is, we have molecules and atoms. So these electrons, they cannot, traverse the atmosphere without meeting at some point an atom or a molecule. And when it does so, it bumps into it and transfers its energy. And when that happens, atoms and molecules, they don't like having this excess energy. They want to get rid of it. And they can only do so by producing a photon of light. And so that's how basically colors are created. So we have the main auroral colors are green, pink, red, and purple. We have variations of those depending on what atom is. It's mostly atoms actually that produce auroral colors. Depending on what atom or molecule is producing the color. For example, oxygen produces green and red, and then nitrogen or ionized nitrogen produce usually colors in a deep blue or in the pink or red. So these entities are usually not that well mixed. We have almost like stories in the sky. We have like layers. And so we usually have the lower pink, it's usually the lowest color. Then it transitions into green, and then it transitions into red. And the purple happens sometimes inside the green. So it's like an intricate process in the formation of colors there. We can have mixes as well when we have a big storm, then we have the colors mix more. And then when we have moonlight or light pollution or even twilight, those affect the colors very highly. For example, the moonlight will transform any red into magenta or purple, even blue sometimes. So we have this, we have to be careful about auroral colors. And to finish on that, can we predict the colors? I would answer, generally speaking, no, but actually there is a way of predicting what type of color you will get. So we distinguish mainly two big events that produce the aurora. I'm going to say solar events that produce the aurora here on Earth. The first one we talked about it already is CMEs, is coronal mass ejections, also known as solar storms, and these tend to produce more red and green colors with a very superficial precipitation of electrons. The other event is called the coronal hole high-speed stream. So pardon me for the the complicated word, but they happen a bit more often and a bit more. They're, I guess, a bit more stable in a way. They come back. One solar rotation after the other. They may come back, sometimes they don't, but most of the time they do. And these produce more very quick, very bright pink and green dances. So I'm not sure which one you saw in Iceland, but I'm guessing that was the pink and green, more of, the pink and green aurora.
Yeah, I saw both, but yeah. I mean, there were definitely nights where it sounds like it was one of those mini storms where it was very still, but there was still lots of patterns, but not a lot of movement. And then there was a couple of nights where it was dancing all over the place and you were just like, what am I looking at here? Yeah. Well, you already touched on one of the myths in terms of KP index. What are some other common myths that you constantly are finding yourself having to debunk relating to the aurora?
All right, so I guess the biggest myth that we have to debunk when we talk about aurora is the fact that the aurora happens the year round, right? And people think there is, because we say there is a season, but when you say there is a season, you always need to precise where the season is, because the season is location dependent. The aurora happens the year round, so it doesn't matter, whether it's spring, summer, if it's cloudy, if it's raining, if it's snowing, the aurora happens regardless at the favor of the solar wind. So when we talk about aurora season, the only thing that prevents us basically from seeing the aurora is the amount of light in the night sky. And that is determined by the solar calendar, right? Because here in the Arctic, for example, I'm at 69 degrees north. That's very high latitudes, geographic latitudes. And so at the moment, if I turn my screen again, it's 8:30 at night and it's clear as day. It's daylight, right? So at the moment, there could be aurora in the night sky, and there probably is, but the sunlight washes it away. So there's no way for me to make out any aurora right now. So I need to wait until we have at the very least, if you're acquainted with the types of twilights, we have civil twilight after sunset, for example, then nautical twilight, then astronomical twilight, and then nighttime. So at the very least, you need to wait for nautical twilight conditions. So that's when you can make up the first stars in the sky. That's when you can start seeing the brightest of auroras. But for better visibility, you need to wait for nighttime for sure. So we don't get those conditions until, late August. So for us, the aurora season is from late August to the start of April. Basically, that's when it's dark enough in the sky to see the aurora. But for example, Fairbanks, Alaska, which actually lies lower than us, but geomagnetically speaking, they're at the same latitude. That's what's hard to understand, is that although the geographic latitude is different, the aurora is tilted. The oval is tilted towards North America, so it favors you guys in North America compared to us. But anyways, Fairbanks is lower in latitude, so they have a broader aurora season. The last one explosive aurora or explosive nature of the aurora, and that's when the aurora is kind of like dim in the sky, right? And it gets people to go back home or to leave, and that's a big mistake to make. Is especially around the midnight sector again, the aurora is very explosive. That means at some point it will be quiet and dim. That's very normal. Even sometimes it disappears completely from the sky, and it kind of needs this quiet. It's like the calm before the storm. It's a quite analogy with terrestrial weather. You kind of need this calm for the aurora to explode. So please don't go to bed early. I would say, when you're 2-3 hours past that midnight sector, then you can go to bed, because in the morning sector it's kind of like a boring, pulsating, or well, I'm not gonna say boring, but a less spectacular pulsating aurora. So for photography, it's not that nice. Really what you want to be able to capture is those big explosions. Even the structure during pulsating auroras is not nice, so even if you had your composition, it's not going to render very nice. It's going to be a big blob, or the whole sky will be filled with green. It could be nice for something, but
Right.
you will get bored very quickly.
Oh yeah, I definitely experienced that. All right, well, let's shift gears and talk more about the business side of your photography, because you're super niche, right? You focus pretty much on one subject for the most part, and so I'm curious how you've managed to run a business solely focused on the aurora.
That's a good question. So I'm not gonna lie to you. It's a lot of work and a lot of sacrifices that I made over the years, and I've kind of sacrificed a lot of my content to be published online. Right? It's kind of, I'm not gonna say it's free for everybody to use, because it's definitely not free for everybody to use. But I think you have to put yourself forward on social media, especially, and really not hesitate to publish, and make a name for yourself. At least that's how I did it. I know it's different for everybody, because we have different backgrounds and different stories, but that's how I did it. I think I started producing a lot of content when I arrived in Norway. I found a job, that allowed me to have time on the side to. I was working at a resort that focused on the aurora, so already that was a big plus for me. They had a reindeer there, so that helped me to get pictures with the reindeer. Something that had been done before, but maybe not with the same setup and the same kind of brightness of aurora, that same wow effect. So that really allowed me to be, in a place on Earth that is absolutely magical, and that allowed me to get a lot of beautiful content. And I think that's what made the difference, as opposed to me staying in France, for example, and having to pay money to get somewhere, to Iceland or to Alaska or to Canada. I don't know. So that's how I did it. I think what also helped a lot was, to really dive into the subject of aurora. So when you want to go into a niche subject, you really need to know the subject inside and out, I think. And so the cool thing with the aurora or aurora science is that it's a very novel science, it's a very new science. And so there are still a lot of discoveries that are being made, and there's still lots of things that we don't know, and that are at the stage of, this group of scientists say it's one thing, and this group of scientists disagrees completely, right? So there's still a lot of disputes in this world, and as you can imagine, and as we discussed, there are lots of misconceptions because of this novelty of science. And that's where I come in with I built up a course where it's not necessarily for the new beginner, and it's mostly for photographers or people who really want to get more hands-on with the aurora, to really understand the aurora very deeply in that regard. And I think that has worked for me really well over the past 2 years. That's always, whenever there's, a job or a gig that comes up, then you just take it. You're not really, picky on that. You have to get the money where it is when you're a quote unquote starving artist. But to get stability in the job, I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of people. And it came for me with the passive revenue stream on social media. So I monetize some of my videos, and also the fact that I posted a lot on social media. I got it got viewed by a lot of people, and especially people in the production industry or documentary industry, and that's how I got I built my portfolio. Like I think a lot of photographers go directly to clients or got the word of mouth to build their portfolio. And with me, it was a bit different. I really put myself forward a bit too much sometimes, if you ask me, on social media. And these people from the production companies, they contacted me to BBC and other production companies. They contacted me to get my time lapses licensed, and now I couldn't be happier, to be honest. I have my stuff on Netflix, on the BBC, on not National Geographic yet, but it's coming on major channels. So it's really rewarding.
Yeah, no, congratulations. I'm curious. It sounds like you're similar to a lot of photographers that I know that are making it, and that you've probably had to make some sacrifices to get to this point. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about some of the things that you've had to give up or put to the side in order to make this happen.
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing you need to sacrifice is your time and your personal life. So no, well, very little. I'm not gonna say no, because there, you still have a bit of time, but social life, that's always to that detriment. You kind of need to not put a cross on it, but just limit your social life. You need to be spending a lot of time outside. There's no other. I don't think there's any other loophole that you can use. Spend a lot of time watching videos, learning from other people. I spent a lot of time diving into scientific articles. Like, who does that, right? So yeah, you're gonna miss weddings, you're gonna miss birthdays, but at the end of the day, you kind of try to explain to your family, but that's for a good cause. That's for my survival. Basically, this is what I choose for a living. So if you understand this right now, and you see in a few years, I'll definitely be able to attend these weddings and birthdays and family events. So that's the first round of sacrifice. And I think the second round of sacrifice is money-wise. You need to invest a lot on gear. That's for one. But I think that's the same for a lot of debuting photographers. But also I was going to say travel. And of course, that's especially true. That wasn't that much true for me, because I was already on location, I guess. But for a lot of photographers, they need to go places to get content. And at the very beginning, before getting the job in Norway, I was actually doing my last trip, because I had given me 1 year with my photography company to say, okay, at the end of 1 year, if I didn't make it, if I didn't have enough clients, or if I didn't make enough money, then I'm gonna give up and go back to my teaching position, or at least to my degree. And I was doing this last trip in Sweden to get Aurora content, and I was just basically about to give up. Right, and that's the very last trip, the very last straw, I guess, before being completely broke. And out of the blue, I got this message from what was going to be my next boss, my next job in Norway, asking me to come visit and make the transition into Norway. So if I have I know it's going to be a bit cheesy, but if I have a piece of advice for people that are listening, maybe new photographers that want to go pro, is that never, ever, 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 ever give up on what you're doing. And, you know, that might be your last, you think that might be your last adventure, or you're just about to give up, and then something comes up and kind of saves you and kind of keeps you into that realm of photography. So I'm not going to say that's going to happen every time, but if you persevere, the chances of that happening to you are getting higher.
Yeah, I'm in this Discord channel with a lot of other photographers, and we talk about opportunity and luck and kind of like this overlap between the two. Because, I mean, yeah, there's definitely cases of photographers who they just got lucky, like they met the right person at the right time, and it just worked out. The more times you put yourself out there, the more work you put into your craft, the more things that you're trying to get accomplished, that's just another chance. It's like another lottery ticket that you're buying for yourself. And, you know, I haven't necessarily had that happen to me yet, but I've had it in pieces and chunks that have kind of built up over time. So your message definitely resonates with me as well.
Yeah, I agree, and that principle of fact that you just mentioned, that these definitely accumulate over time. So the more you're going to put yourself out there, and put yourself into view, to say it that way, the more you're going to have these opportunities present themselves to you, and that's true now. I mean, you know, once that my name was in the database of the BBC, for example, then I got email after email, you know, asking me, oh, is this footage available for licensing and everything. So really, you know, it just takes sometimes one person or one event, and that's it. So
Yeah. Well, shifting gears a little bit, I would love for you to tell us about the work that you do with nonprofits to study noctilucent clouds, and maybe tell us what the heck those even are.
what are noctilucent clouds? All right, so noctilucent clouds are the highest clouds on Earth. So it's already quite mesmerizing in itself, because most of the clouds that we have on Earth, they happen in a layer of the atmosphere called the troposphere. So there is a layer that occurs between 0 and 7 miles up, right? So that's at the limit of where commercial airlines fly. That's about 7 miles, 10 kilometers up. Slightly above that, because there's a stable layer called the tropopause. But the noctilucent clouds are 7 times higher than those clouds. So they happen so far up, almost at the edge of space, and sometimes we call them space clouds. It's a bit of a funky name, but and they happen in an area of the atmosphere that is very, very tenuous. So what that adjective means is that there aren't a lot of molecules and atoms at that altitude, right? If you climb Mount Everest, you're gonna notice, right? You're probably gonna need an oxygen mask, because the air is so thin. But you're already above 90% of the atmosphere on Mount Everest, right? So try to imagine at 55 miles up, you're above 99.9% of the atmosphere. There's so few atoms and molecules there to breathe in for you, right? So that's not possible for any human to evolve at that altitude unless they're in a spacecraft. But the problem is, it's too low for orbiting, right? So it's a no man's zone to study this layer of the atmosphere. But just to go back on the clouds, it's basically they're made of tiny ice crystals, and so when we see them from the ground, they appear as a layer of glowing cloud against the dark twilight. So we can only see them when the sun is below the horizon and hits them at a precise angle. So usually around the nautical twilight that we talked about earlier, that's when the sun is at the right angle. And so it scatters the light onto those clouds, and we perceive them as a faint glowing cloud against the twilight backdrop, basically.
So, I mean, in night, I'm a big night photographer. Less so now than I used to be, but is that air glow? I mean, that's what we used to always call air glow. Like, oh, that's nice air glow.
That is actually not air glow. So air glow
Okay.
happens slightly over that layer of the atmosphere.
Okay.
These clouds cannot be seen during daytime, and they cannot be seen during nighttime. Air glow can
Okay.
only be seen during late astronomical twilight and nighttime. But they display the same patterns of gravity waves, for example, that air glow often displays. You know, those large scale waves across the sky. So that's why they appear so strangely to us, and they're very like eerie almost, right, in the night sky, because it's like this ghostly white, this blanket of ice basically that's glowing, whereas the rest of the sky is completely, well, not completely dark because you're in the twilight, but you can see stars and everything. There's nothing in the sky, and then on the poleward horizon, you get this blanket of glowing tendrils, sometimes creating shapes that are absolutely out of this world. Actually, if you look at those clouds, you can. Some people say they look like alien clouds, and actually we see them on Mars as well. So beautiful clouds. And why am I involved in those in this science or in this field of science? Is because there's been a trend for the past 30 years that it seems that we are getting more and more sightings of these clouds, and not only brighter but also at lower latitudes than what they usually are, and that is polar latitudes, so not below 60 degrees north in the northern hemisphere. Of course, they happen only in the summer in the northern hemisphere, and of course in the summer, so our winter, in the southern hemisphere. There's been a trend during the past 30 years that we have more sightings of them, and there's no way for us to know for now precisely why that happens. And some theories say that it's because of climate change. And we can correlate, for example, the concentration of methane in the atmosphere, or CO2, and those produce water vapor by oxidation. So it's a mouthful, I know, but ultimately they may create more of these noctilucent clouds. So when people talk about climate change, right, that's something that they cannot really see yet, right? Or they cannot, maybe the only thing they can do is feel it with the temperature that's getting generally warmer, right? But other than that, there's no visual clues, there's no visual window into climate change. So for the very first time in history, or at least recent history, there could be an indicator that is visual, that helps us basically visualize climate change. So if really those two are correlated, if NLCs, noctilucent clouds, indeed indicate climate change, that's a huge thing to study, right? So that's where I come in and say, okay, that's actually very interesting.
Yeah.
And I started, when I was in Denmark, I started getting interest into anything night sky, and obviously NLCs are one of these phenomena. And I started taking time lapses of these beautiful clouds, and that got seen on Facebook by the CEO of this non-profit organization based out of Colorado, I think it is. It's called Project Possum. The project aims at studying these noctilucent clouds and, as a broader subject, the mesosphere, which is the layer of the atmosphere where they occur, basically. And so the project kind of aims, it's partly NASA funded, and it aims at ultimately launching astronaut candidates into space or into that layer of the atmosphere to study the clouds, whether by imaging the clouds or by actually probing for the very first time this layer of the atmosphere. So it's a fascinating project. It involves aeronautics, space science, being an astronaut, which is always, in people's head, it's always, oh my God, when you pronounce the name NASA, like, you get all these light bulbs in your head going, oh my God, that's absolutely crazy. And I actually got to work with a few retired NASA astronauts. It's absolutely incredible to hear about their experience in space and everything. Yeah, so it touches on a lot of different subjects, and it also enables me to work with a lot of different actors in the space industry. And yeah, it's just fascinating.
That sounds awesome. Well, I had one more space weather question for you, and you feel free to tell me you don't know the answer because we never talked about it before. But there's this super rare space phenomenon that I've always wanted to photograph. I think they're called sprites. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so I'm in no way any expert on the subject, but I think I know enough to give like a general
like
what
what
it is.
the heck they are, and like because
Yeah.
it almost looks like an alien invasion. Like they're these red spikes looking things that are like above the clouds. I mean, it looks insane.
It's like a jellyfish, almost like a
Yeah, yeah.
alien jellyfish coming
Right, you're
to
like, oh, we're about to get invaded.
that. Well, actually, I think there is such a thing as a sprite jellyfish or something like that they found. It's like a giant sprite. So what are these optical phenomena? So, because they are optical phenomena, they occur above thunderstorms, or at least above the troposphere, right? Above active turbulences in the troposphere. So that usually is electrical activity in the troposphere, and so that is, thunderstorms and discharge of plasma in the troposphere, and that induces, to make it simple, that induces a difference in charge between the troposphere and the higher atmosphere. Those things also happen in, around the same place as NLCs and Aurora, where the atmosphere is charged, and so that difference in charge creates a potential, and that potential eventually creates or can create a discharge of light or plasma. And the sprites that we see, for example, they're not alone as a phenomenon. We have jets and pixies and elves and other funky names. They happen because of this discharge of plasma into the upper atmosphere. And so they are really, really hard to photograph because they're so elusive, right? When you think about lightning, right? It's a split second, and if you don't have a little device that I think you can find these little devices that work on
triggers.
The frequency triggers, right? You're not gonna, or you need a lot of luck to be able to photograph lightning. Well, that's the same with sprites. You're gonna have to. I think a lot of the debuting, or there are not a lot of sprite photographers in the world. I know only of a handful of them, and at the very start they were only using film to. They will continuously filming, a thunderstorm cell, or is that called a mesocell? I can't remember the full name of it. Those huge cells, the giant cells that you get in the U.S. in the tornado alley, and they were looking from a distance, from a few hundred miles distance above that cell, and if they were lucky, they were gonna film these giant sprites and jets, and they were just grabbing a frame grab basically from that film, and afterwards I think Paul Smith, which is one of the most famous sprite photographers, I think now he's using a special device as well that can sort of predict as well as lightning, but I'm not sure if it's on the same frequency, so I cannot tell you. but he can be there to photograph those sprites with the camera, and he can use longer focal lengths because then of course that's a lot of luck is involved, but he was able to photograph crazy shapes of these mesmerizing.
Yeah. I've seen some of the photos. I'm just like, wow. Um, yeah. So it sounds like they're very transient. Like they don't last. Like it's like just a blast of light and then it's gone.
LTEs, light, luminous transient events,
Yeah.
as they're. So yeah, you used the right adjective actually.
Okay. Awesome. Well, couple more questions. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what people can expect and how to find out more information about your Aurora chasing course?
All right, so I offer these courses. I repeat myself; they're probably not for someone that just got into Aurora photography. It's more for the more advanced chaser or photographer that wants to gain more knowledge about how all those things come together, and trying to debunk all the stuff that we've been taught on social media, or even on sometimes on the websites that we have. What are the best tools? So I offer these courses monthly via Zoom, but I don't do them specifically during the summer. So it's mainly during the My Aurora season, starting from August and spanning towards April, I think. So right now I'm having a break because these courses demand a lot of concentration for me. They actually are a series of between 4 and 5 weekly sessions of 3 hours. So the
Oh
course
wow, yeah.
itself is massive, right? There's lots of information in that course, and so for people to digest it better, I've kind of I've broken it down into several pieces, several sessions. I'm gonna start the sessions in July again, and the best way to for people to attend, or at least to be put on the waiting list, is just to send me an email, or to look at on my website. I have all my information there. It's www.nightlightsfilms, so light plural, films plural.com. And they can also contact me on social media. It's fairly easy to find me. They can find my name, but they can also find, I'm usually present as Night Lights or Night Lights Films on social media. I'm present on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. I'm also on YouTube because I do a lot of videos. So I'm very reactive on there. So they can. I have a lot of requests. So the courses are working a lot, which is positive for me. But I do have a lot of requests, and I have limited places each month, about 10 spots. So if people can contact me in advance, then I can secure spots for them for sure.
Well, that's a good problem to have.
It is. It is.
Awesome, man. Well, last question I have for you is, who are some people that you recommend for the podcast? Who should we know more about or try to talk to?
Right. I'm going to start with who inspired me for to get into astrophotography. So when I was at the very beginning, when it was I was just debuting in astrophotography, I was looking at inspiration. Of course, we all do that, I guess, for any kind of style or ideas of composition. And I really want to recommend. So the very first person that got me into what I do now is, I'm not sure. Hopefully, I pronounce his name correctly. I met him in person actually. He came to Norway, and that's Peter or Petr Horalek. He's from Czech Republic, and he's a very famous astrophotographer. He's been doing this for years, and he's a ESO ambassador, and he takes gorgeous compositions that are very, to me at least, because it's always comes down to your tastes. His pictures look very natural to me. not overdone, not overprocessed. He does everything from Milky Way to eclipses to anything astro related, basically. So that's the first one. The second one was Yuri Beletsky. He's also an ESO ambassador and works full time, I think, for the ALMA Observatory in Chile. He's been taking absolutely insane compositions. I really love his style, with where you can see both the foreground and the background. It's very hard at night to get these things right with the blending of the foreground and the background. And I think he does it with parsimony. He does it really well, and it's always been a huge source of inspiration for me. So the third person I wanted to name today was Alan Wallace, because we started astrophotography at about the same time, and we were born about the same time as well, and our stories kind of resemble each other. So I don't think our style, we have not completely, but we have different styles of still photography, at least, but we match in terms of a lot of things, and the way he approaches astrophotography, the way he approaches the gear, going into the field, the way he approaches composition. I think he does more about composition, and I focus more on the sky. But we've had trips together, we did collaborations together, so he's a very good pal of mine, and I really recommend him because he's full of ideas and he's full of knowledge. He's just published a book that is what I call the Bible of astrophotography, I'm sure that he would be a good subject for you to have on the podcast. Then the fourth person, and I think they come together, the fourth and the fifth person, those are Benjamin Baccarat and Ralph Rohner. So I put them together, and because I think they've photographed together a lot. They both live in Switzerland, and they have very distinctive styles as well that are very alike. And they started this, I think, they're some of the pioneers in this trend of having a really detailed foreground of, that can be mountains, that can be lakes, that can be anything. But really what they've focused on over the years is to really gain more details in the background sky, usually, right? When you take a photograph of the night sky, you have a foreground and maybe a Milky Way, but most people would take a single shot of the Milky Way. Even if it's a track shot, they will take just a single shot. Some people do panoramas, but most people would do single shots because it's easier. They point and shoot, and then they do something else, right? What these two do is that they spend hours and hours and hours at the same location, and they would use a tracker for the sky, so they would gain more signal from the sky. They will reveal beautiful nebulae and things that usually we cannot see in one single exposure, and they would superpose that or overlap that on top of the original foreground, and they don't do any type of manipulation with the size and everything. They try to respect, of course it's people can do whatever they want, and I'm not here to judge, but I really like that they respect the size of the foreground and the background, and they use the same focal length and everything.
Yeah, so we call them deepscapes.
Yeah, deepscapes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I got into that actually when I started astrophotography, and I started this. I didn't start because I took it from. I took the idea from someone else in the US. I think what was his name? Dakota Labs. I think he's got.
Oh yeah. Randy Halverson.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
And he was one of the first. Actually, he was the first time lapse that I saw of a deep sky object. Like, who does deep sky time lapse? Like, where does that fit in? And so I had the idea of expanding this technique, and for example, the Andromeda Galaxy against the background, or close-up of the Milky Way core against the background, Rho Ophiuchi, which is a colorful area of the night sky against background. So I did a lot of things, and these two that I just named, Benjamin and Ralph, they take it to the next level. They're just so much, so much out there. They're just
Oh yeah, it's
what they do is just
extreme.
beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm actually a co-moderator of Nightscaper Facebook group with Ralph and Yuri on Facebook. So
nice.
Ralph's always producing some wild stuff.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I know at the very start of the podcast, we had alluded to some interesting interactions between you and Elon Musk on Twitter, and we'll save that for our Patreon episode. So if people are really interested about content theft and Twitter and Elon Musk and how that all went down with you, join us over on Patreon. But for now, we're going to sign off, and I just wanted to thank you for your time, Adrien.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. It's been a blast. I hope that the listeners were able to at least get a little bit on the Aurora, to hopefully not to make the biggest mistakes they can make and capture the Aurora. But if they have any other question, as long as it's not like, it doesn't take me an hour, I'm really happy to answer any short questions on social media that they might have as well. So
Awesome.
No worries for that.
Well, thank you, Adrien, for the great conversation on today's podcast. I learned a lot, and I think our listeners will as well. Just a reminder to listeners that Adrien is offering a discount to listeners on his Aurora Chasing course using the code FSTOPCollab2023. Just head over to nightlightsfilm.com or find a link in the show notes. I also wanted to let you know that we recorded a juicy episode where Adrien discusses his recent hands-on spat with Elon Musk on Twitter that was in regards to a copyright infringement issue. It's well worth your time to listen, and as a bonus, you help support the podcast as well. Just go to patreon.com/fstop and listen to join. We'll see you there. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.